Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Caixin Dialogue. This is part of a collaborative Nobel Perspectives series brought to you by Caixin Global and UBS, one of the world's leading financial institutions and the largest wealth manager. In China, UBS has also developed in the domestic market for over 30 years. Today, in the Caixin Dialogue, we're delighted and extremely honored to have Professor Esther Duflo as our speaker. Professor Esther Duflo is currently the Professor of Poverty Alleviation and Development Economics at MIT, and I'm your host, Li Xing, Managing Editor of Caixin Global. A quick introduction about Professor Duflo. She was born in Paris to a math professor and a pediatrician. After high school, she went to l'École Normale Supérieure, planning to specialize in history. But then she spent some time in Moscow in the early 90s and later went to MIT for grad school and worked there for her PhD. Her career has been devoted to how to bring people out of poverty by researching and by linking researchers to policymakers around the world through the platform of Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, and have made really tangible, impactful changes. Together with two colleagues, Professor Duflo received the Nobel Prize of Economics in 2019, as we all know. Our topic today is good economics for post-pandemic era. I want to start from the gender angle, though, female leadership and the role of women. Professor Duflo, I like what you said in your Nobel Prize acceptance speech, that from childhood, you decided that never let gender define what I would or could do. Well, gender-wise, we actually find female leaders could do better, and the pandemic is a case in point. So why is that happening?
So first of all, I think female leader can do better. In fact, there is great evidence coming out, for example, of India, which randomly selects some villages and said only women can compete there. And then in each election, 1/3 of villages are reserved for women and the other 2/3 are not reserved for women. And with some co-authors, we compared the places that are led by women to the places that are mostly not led by women because they are not reserved. And we found that women leaders are better at taking the interest of other women into account. They do stuff that women want, for example, water. And also over time, they simply do more. They become more effective than men, partly because they are more devoted to their job as leaders. We also found that they are helpful as role models. So girls in the villages are more likely to stay in school, in middle school and high schools, because their ambition has changed when they have a woman leader. And finally, we discovered that when citizens find out what women can do, their own prejudices against female as leaders change, and they become more open to have female leaders, and they become more likely to elect another woman in an unreserved seat the next time around. So all of that was found with very rigorous research we've done with JPAL, using this random allocation of women and men. With the pandemic, it's a little more complicated because the countries that have elected women are also different than the countries that haven't. So, for example, if Germany chose Angela Merkel and New Zealand chose Jacinda Ardern, maybe it's because there are a lot about the German people and the New Zealand people that also explain why, in general, they would be good at fighting pandemics. So it's hard to say that women are better just from looking at the fact that, in fact, in countries led by women, the fight against the pandemic has been better, in particular in the early days. But what certainly we've discovered, what many people have discovered, is the fact that women definitely can lead and can do a good job. And I hope that this is going to have an impact in who they decide to elect in the future. I hope that the prejudice that women should not lead is slowly being eroded by seeing these powerful women doing a great job in very difficult circumstances.
Very powerful message. And you compared the Indian example was the woman really in the world leadership role. But what changes you think the pandemic would bring to the role of women in our society in general, not just those in the top leading positions?
So in general, I think unfortunately the pandemic was probably taking us some steps back in the role of women in society. I think there is in many countries, both rich and lower income countries, latent social norms that when the going is tough, men should be privileged. So, for example, many people are willing to say if there is not enough job, they should go to men first. And there is also a social norm that it's for women to take care of the children ultimately in most countries. And both of these things have really worked against women during the pandemic. First of all, because there was a shortage of jobs during the pandemic itself, and women were more likely to drop out of the labor force. That has been true both in richer and in poorer countries. Second of all, because there was a shortage of childcare options, and this burden was primarily fell back on women. So what we need to do now is to take that into account and to take some steps to ensure that these temporary steps backwards don't become a permanent delay in the advancement of women in society.
Exactly. If we can zoom in on China, gender issue in China is actually quite unique. We have a long tradition, what we say, women holding up half of the sky, and I would say half of the sky and the entire floor. And if you look at the numbers, the female work participation rate is very high, and the Chinese women, female entrepreneurs are very, very extremely successful. And if I can cite a number out of the Hulu report, 4 of the 5 top most successful female entrepreneurs in the world are Chinese. Meanwhile, there's increasing gender imbalances in the population and a looming challenge of low fertility rates, this and that. So what would you advise as the key to tackle demographic issues in China, especially regarding women's role in the society, and what fundamental changes are needed to support women's role in China?
Well, the most important is to look at the situation with as much realism as possible. I think the defining fact about gender issues in China is that it's the country in the world with the biggest gender imbalance at birth. Women, one child generation with a huge lopsided number of boys are now trying to look for partners, and there just are not enough women. And I think the fact that you mentioned that the women who do make it are now powerful is in some sense related to the first fact. Then there are very few women around. The women who are there become extraordinarily valuable. And so now there is maybe more bargaining power for women in the household, and there is more prominence of women as entrepreneurs. But unless and until we go back to the vast majorities of people's views about the contribution of girls in society and the fact that they can have girls and do well with them, then this China is going to have to grapple with a fundamental gender problem in its society, which is turning into a fundamental demographic problem, because all these young boys who can't get married are not a force for the good.
Completely agree. It has to start with the change of attitude, and the change of attitude goes hand in hand with the change of policy, and the problem is really pressing. Slightly move on from China and also compare with France. Another very pressing demographic issue is aging. France is raising retirement age, and China's retirement age has been at 60 for men and 50-55 for women. So from countries such as France, US, and India that you are very familiar with, what might be helpful for raising in retirement age to overcome demographic challenges for China and for other countries?
So the demographic problems in terms of the aging of the population has two sides. One is the demographic forces. So you need more young people to take care of the old people. And of course, China was so effective in reducing the growth of the population that it just doesn't have young people anymore. And now, of course, the one-child policy gets relaxed, but now, considering the future, and because demographic trends are so slow, China would need to start now to really encourage people to have children, which is not going to be easy because the social norm rarely pervaded in the population. So I don't think people are so excited to have many children now. But what China needs now is children. That's for sure. That's once. And in Europe, unfortunately, people have been completely free to have children as much as they want, but they haven't had many children. And so the aging of the population comes from the fact that there are not enough children. And in Europe has been grappling with this issue of trying to encourage people to have children with not much success. More success in France than in neighboring countries like Germany, Italy, or Spain, but still limited success. The other side of it then is is the retirement age. People live longer, they live healthier life. In China, an early retirement age was justified by the fact that people had very hard lives, with physical labor, etc. A lot of them, and therefore by 55 or 60, they just were tired. Now, many people are working in offices or in less demanding jobs, and logically they would be able to extend their productive life till much longer, and they might want to, and also when they retire, they have more chances to enjoy their retirement because they live for a very long time. In France, this idea of increasing the retirement age has not gone down well at all. It is not popular. And basically, the question of the social security deficit has been with us for, I think, since I'm a conscious human being, I remember the discussion, and I don't remember any progress. And every subsequent administrations has stumbled upon that. So my advice to China would be to start tackling it very soon, before people kind of get used to the idea that it's actually nice to retire at 55, even if you're going to live till 85. Because those are very, very long life, 30 years of retirement to finance from, a shrinking base of young adults. One thing that is being discussed in France, and I think would be very helpful for China, is to have retirement age that depends on your profession. So where the office goers and people who have a reasonably cushy job can continue working, but the still large number of people who have very difficult physical jobs can retire earlier, and I think that might help in easing that transition towards longer productive lives.
A very powerful message. Really, the time to fixing the demographic problem is now. Time to encourage people to have children. Time to tackle the retirement age, or there was a differentiated policy for the transition. Thank you for that insight. We slightly switched from the female and leadership topic to the pandemic and poverty, which is still very pressing. We're still in the emergency mode in a lot of countries. What do you think is or could be the most effective stimulus in response to this emergency situation in order to ensure families and individuals to access health services without fear of the financial consequences?
So regardless of whether we have a pandemic or not, it's really essential for people, in particular the poorest people in the world, to be able to access healthcare. In a lot of countries, there is a first layer of healthcare access that is free, but that the quality of that layer is low. And this is something that China has enormously benefited from, to have a quality of a first layer of healthcare system to be very high, even when China was still a much poorer country. This is something, for example, in comparison between India and China, that China from very early on has invested in this basic human development, good basic healthcare available, rural doctors, rural nurses, etc. So this is something which is a good model to aspire, but unfortunately it's a bit difficult to put in place once there is no culture to put it in place. Because, for example, in India, doctors are just reluctant to go to the countryside, and nurses are reluctant to the countryside, and if they go, they don't really work very hard, and you don't kind of instill a culture of service in overnight. Therefore, one needs to find some quicker way to reach the people effectively, and in particular to reach the people with preventive care. And this is something which is now a problem that is common to many countries, is the non-communicable diseases like diabetes, hypertension, that require preventive care, management, behavioral management, etc. That's a problem you have in China, that's a problem they have in India, that's a problem that's coming in Africa even. So for that, what's important is to make it, I think it's possible to use technology to make the adequate treatment closer and closer to the people, to give them incentives to monitor their own health and to act in their own behavior, and to try and kind of slowly instill this behavior. There's plenty of evidence that shows that people are perfectly willing to invest in their health when they are sick, but much less to prevent sickness. And for that, we can use behavioral economics and small incentive and social encouragement to get people to get vaccinated, to get people to vaccinate their own children, to get people to sleep under a bed net in malaria-infested regions, to get people to take care of their diabetes before it becomes unmanageable.
So quality and availability of basic public services really matters, and smart policies can help.
So, and it is really important to remember that, because basically China has an enormous amount of power to do enormous amount of good to a lot of people, which are simply its poor citizens in rural areas. Yeah. And it's one thing that as a society you just need to keep in mind, is that there is Shanghai, and there are also people who live extremely poor lives, and that in some sense that's a huge opportunity, because like in most of the world, the money that is being spent on poor people is mostly spent by the governments themselves. Aid budget are a tiny amount of the money that is spent on the poor worldwide. What is important is good, solid domestic policies that are effective, that are pragmatic, and that are oriented towards the poor. And China can totally do, has plenty of scope of improvement to do that in their own country, for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. Since we're talking about inequality, I remember reading a report that the inequality problem is actually exacerbated with the pandemic. And in the World Inequality Report 2022, you and Professor Banerjee wrote the foreword and says the contemporary inequalities are close to early 20th century levels, almost at the peak of the Western imperialism. So how can government better deal with the growing social inequalities, including China?
So I think it starts with willingness. There is nothing in inequality that is the product of natural forces that we cannot fight against. In the earliest 20th century, inequalities worldwide were huge. And then with the shock of the 1929 crisis, followed by the Second World War, it collapsed. And for a while, it was really low at the worldwide level, not out of natural evolution, but simply because government had a series of measures in place to keep it low. That starts with taxes, which are, the progressive income taxation is a wonderful invention of the 19th century. That started with nationalization of assets, which means that everybody basically started more or less from the same level. that continued with regulation that protected workers, protected their right to unionize and to bargain for better conditions. And all of that got eroded, first starting with the US and the UK in the 1980s, and then other countries taking a cue that this is how one needs to behave. But there is really no reason why this should be the right way to set it up. In fact, there is plenty of reason why it's not, because all this discontent that is brewing everywhere comes in part in reaction to this huge increase in inequality, and the situation becomes untenable. And therefore, I think even for as an instinct of self-preservation, wealthy people and bankers and so on should really want higher taxes on both on income and particularly on wealth.
What are the roadblocks of those sensible, responsible policies that people know that should be implemented but didn't do well?
There are two roadblocks. One is that at the level of the general opinions, people hate the idea of increasing taxes, even if it's not their taxes. It's very difficult for people, the common people, people who make, let's say, the median income, to not be worried that if taxes increase on the rich, that's not coming for them at some point or another. So that's an issue, because tax increases are never popular, and tax decreases are always popular, even if they are really not benefiting anybody. And so the history since Ronald Reagan in the US, for example, is every Republican president lowers taxes, and every Democratic president increases them a little bit, but not to the point where they were lowered before. So as a result, the taxes keeps eroding and keeps eroding and keeps eroding. So that's one issue. The other issue is that the rich people are able to organize. They have money to do that. They have the ability to lobby. They have power on people's electoral campaign. And therefore, their voices count for more. And ultimately, the vast majority of the rich people, not all of them, but ultimately, they would prefer not to pay taxes. So ultimately, I think the rich people really need to understand that that's not sustainable. And more of them need to. Some of them do. Sometimes you have people signing, petitions that taxes should go higher. But when the time comes, there is always a financial engineering to kind of try and reduce your, at the individual level, people are, when the time comes, always feel that they should somehow minimize their tax bills. And at the social level, there is also no pressure to increase it. So, and support for politicians that decrease it. So those are the two core issues. I should say, by the way, that in coming to the issue of taxes, not as a inequality fighting rule, but as a way of increasing the place of the government. For developing countries, there is a clear understanding that they need to increase their tax base as a function of their GDP. And there again, that's a very different trajectory of China and India. In China, from the post-war, when the tax threshold for exemption was never raised, so more and more people got into the tax nets, and therefore the tax revenue as a fraction of GDP kept increasing, which gave China the money to do the type of things that we were discussing before, in particular good healthcare, education, etc. In India, they increased the threshold as people became richer, so the tax base as a fraction of GDP didn't increase. And that really hobbles the Indian state, has hobbled and still hobbles the Indian state in its response to anything, from the pandemic to having a good education system. It just doesn't have enough money. And they started from the same level, and then the China experience, which was much more pro-tax, was ultimately much better for the development of the country.
Interesting comparison of that. Follow-up of that is you mentioned about the China policy and the China practices. And now China has a new vision, that is the common prosperity. It has the vision from the beginning, but now the put that front and center of the policy for the next couple of decades. How do you think about this vision?
Well, clearly it should be everybody's vision. And if you ask any leader anywhere in the world, what's your vision? They are not going to say, well, I want prosperity for the very few. So the question is always, so certainly there is, I think, broad agreement. It's very hard not to be in broad agreement with the vision. The question becomes, not just for China, but for any country, is how do you put this vision in practice? And then it becomes, not only you need to want to do something, but you need to have the right tools to do something. And the limits that we have in a lot of countries is to find out what works and what doesn't work in policy. And that's where, the role of experimentation, policy experimentation, is really critical. And China has, traditionally been very good at policy experimentation, trying things out and then seeing whether it works and continuing. But interestingly, what we've seen in the last few years is that experimentation gets a little bit distorted by the fact that only people who think they are going to do well with a particular policy are willing to try it out. And therefore, the successes of attempts of pilot, of trial policies might be overinflated compared to the successes we're going to get for the entire countries when the policy is rolled out. So I think if China wants to be the most effective it can be in using its considerable resources for the betterment of everyone in the country, it really needs to go back to this real emphasis on good experimentation. And I'm sure that's something that can be done and that would kind of accelerate the process compared to the situation we have now.
Stick to the good experiment. Let me introduce another set of stakeholders. We talk about the country policies. I read a lot about that in your books as well. But how about the private sector? Currently, it becomes almost everyone has to pledge the ESG. And is that just a box to check? Or do you think that to promote ESG actually do help us improve social inequality, and instead of just pure grandstanding of the private sector?
I think for the moment, in many cases, it's a box to check. But it's already a good thing that it's a box to check, because this really is coming from a demand from the consumer base and from the workers, particularly in the younger generation, that's much more attuned to the importance of ESG consideration. So the question now is, how do you go from these good intentions and this checking box to actually doing something? And how do you ensure that for the majority of firms, not just the best firms, it doesn't, this is not gamed to the point where it's not useful. And we already seen many stories. There is enormous amount of money to be made in ESG. And we have already seen many stories where the ESG kind of certification are being fudged in a way that, legally or illegally, and sometimes illegally, are being fudged in a way that makes them useless. So I think we need to now, and leaders such as your company, for example, media leader like your company, also media leader like our common host, UBS, needs to start thinking about how do we establish what is effective and not effective in the ESG sector, so that the ESG money goes to effective policies. And it's very different than knowing what works in business. Because when work in business, you introduce a new product. If it doesn't work, nobody wants it. That's fine, you can stop. In the ESG environment, for the climate or for society, you have to measure impact. And impact can only be measured by experimentation. We go back to the experimentation idea, like it is for government. Like in the same way that you determine that a policy is effective is by trying out rigorously and measuring the impact compared to a counterfactual. Similarly, this needs to be done with ESG. And that's why in JPAL, we try to work. For example, we have an initiative on climate change, the Caixin initiative, where we really tried to have a lot of experiments on various strategies to fight climate change, from paying people to not take out their trees to the impact of weatherization of homes, and something work and something don't work. And we need to kind of invest now tons and tons of money in constructing our toolbox so that the ESG money in the future goes to the right outlet. In a sense, we are very behind government in ESG, paradoxically. ESG is now in the same place that governments were 20 years ago, where it's just intuition and feeling what might be good for society or for the environment. And it's not the way it works, or it should work.
That's exactly what I found your lab is doing: research, experiment, and once you find the right tools and the right formula, expand and introduce that to all the stakeholders. Fascinating discussion, and we have a few minutes left, and I will promise we have a lot of young readers participated, and they submitted a lot of questions, and we select a few of them from the young people in China. The first question is by Cheng Danlei from Xi'an Jiaotong University, majoring in applied economics. Her question is, they conducted a survey of poor families in China, and they found that men tend to have clear understanding of families' economic situation, including the housing, land condition, this and that, where women seem to consciously hand over the family's decision-making power to men in the household. Do you think that in a poor situation, poor population, is it necessary to establish the concept of woman power before the situation can be changed? And what positive role can women's participation play in addressing poverty? That's a big question, but really something that really comes close to your research.
Yeah, so I think this is this differential level of knowledge that the question highlights is itself the product of lower empowerment of women, and it can be changed by empower women in the households. There was a great paper about China from Nancy Chen from a few years ago that showed that in places that started growing tea, women became more empowered, and the result of that was a reduction in the rate in the imbalance between boys and girls, showing that just giving women more economic power by making them more valuable in society had impacts on women's strength in the household and on women and on even on up to girl survival. So I think that idea can be expanded further, and we can and should find every way possible to jumpstart the participation of women in the economy, make them valuable economically from the household. And you will see that if they become the breadwinner, or even the main breadwinners, their knowledge of the finances of the household will quickly improve.
So give women economic power first from the household and then from the society. The second question is from Zhang Chujun from Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, majoring in mathematical economics. Her question is, you mentioned in your book, Poor Economics, that poverty trap faced by poor people in developing country, you described that. And I would like to know, are there any differences or similarities between poverty traps faced by poor people in developing and developed countries?
I think there is a major difference, which is the ability of a social protection system that is a little bit more expensive in the richer countries. People do fall into poverty trap in poor countries, often when a shock is compounded by mental health implications of the shocks, where people become so upset by their loss of economic lives or their loss of status that they spiral into depression and from then to sometimes to drug use, etc., which has led to what people Anke and Angus Deaton have called the death of despair. But if you don't have that, then in principle you have a social support system that helps you go back and at least not starve, for example. In poor countries, someone who is thrown off their rockers by a shock can be in a situation where they don't have enough to feed themselves, they don't have enough to feed their kids, and it's there's nothing they can do to really take themselves out of this situation on their own. So those poverty traps are I think, even deeper.
Thanks for sharing the insights. The next question is from Ling, a student from economics in Fudan University. How could you incorporate the differences in local history, culture, institutions into poverty elimination policies? How could market mechanism play a role in that?
Sorry,
how could a market mechanism play a role in poverty eliminating policies?
So I think we have to, in every problem, and poverty elimination is one of them, there can be a role for markets, there can be a role for governments. What's really important is to not think that every single problem can be solved by markets alone. Typically, markets are able to solve the easy problem, where people do what they want to do and are naturally going with the flow, and then the harder problems are left with the government. And poverty elimination is one of them, because at the core, you need redistribution. And companies are not the ones that are going to be redistributing. That said, once you have the willingness to redistribute, then companies can be brought in to deliver some of the services that the governments are ready to pay for. For example, there was an experience in Cambodia of handing off some healthcare system to private sectors, which showed some gain in effectiveness. So the companies can be kind of contracted to deliver services that the government is paying for. But one has to be careful with that as well, because the objectives of the company and the objective of the government might be different, and the company can achieve what they are contracted for at the cost of other things. And there was an experiment of privatizing education in Liberia that showed that this happened. You have an increase in the average test scores in places that were subcontracted to the private sector, but it came at a cost of expelling a lot of the students, and then rotating all the teachers, etc. So it comes at some social cost as well. So this is one set. Then the companies also simply need to think about what they're doing in their own environment. So how they're taking care of their workers, what type of goods they are putting out. Are they goods that are going to ultimately be good for consumers, or just addictive and bad for them? So all of this, not exploiting, not preying on the poor in the type of things that you provide, are roles that companies can and should play simply in their everyday business and the way they choose to make their money.
Very interesting. So the market has the power, but we have to be aware of its incentives and manage their incentives well. And also companies, I think that what we discussed, the ESG scrutiny of the company is actually cutting. More transparency will hold them more accountable towards what they do and towards what they deal with their own little environment. The next question is from Lin Xiaoyang, a student of economics in Tsinghua University. Her question is, since the poor is talented in creating their economic method, such as common fund, written in your book, and the effect of direct funding from the charity can be reduced, does that mean that charity should mostly focus on educating the poor, enabling them, introducing tech or business models, rather than delivering money directly to the poor people's hands?
Yeah, I disagree with that almost entirely, and I think that's it's a temptation that many of the sort of social businesses end of charities is pushed. And the idea is that, all the poor are natural entrepreneurs and all we need to do is enabling that entrepreneurship. The reality is most of the poor are not natural entrepreneurs. They would very much like to have a secure job. And while some of them are, and we need to make sure they have the ability to develop that, that's not the answer for the vast majority of the people. And the vast majority of the people, first of all, need good schools, and they shouldn't have to pay for them. They need good healthcare, and they shouldn't have to pay for that. And that is something that, I don't think charity should be doing. I think government should be doing, but charity can at least develop the models and experiment on the models that government can take on later. But the idea that all the problems can be solved by creating the right markets and stepping aside, I think has been now widely proven to be wrong. It's often not sufficient.
So the social safety net or the basic social goods actually come first: the schools, the healthcare, and then encourage them to give them the means. Another question is from Jiang Yunxi, a student of social study at Tsinghua University. Her question is, his question is, how could we help improve the quality of women and provide more opportunities to girls or younger ones pursuing their education and career?
So this can be done by a variety of actions. We discussed very early on the role of role models. I think powerful female role models are very important. We saw them in politics, we can see them in businesses, and then not only that this role model need to exist, but also putting them in front of an audience, making sure that little girls see that everything they want is possible. And as you said I highlighted in my Nobel Prize speeches, making sure you're just not defined by gender. You're defined by who you are, what you want to do. Everything is possible. So that I think is essential. And then, of course, making sure that that women's talent is being recognized. So girls' talent is being recognized in schools, that scholarship opportunities are given to them. We completed an experiment in Ghana where we gave scholarships to both boys and girls to go to secondary school. And we found that when you give a scholarship to girls, many good things happen. They have fewer children. Those children are healthier. They do better at cognitive tests several years later. The women are able to provide for their family in COVID-19 crisis. And we find almost none of these benefits for the boys who got the scholarship. So this would be kind of a rationale to give most of the scholarships to girls, simply because they tend to be discriminated against in their families and in the schools to start with, and therefore pushing them and giving them a leg up really helps. So that's another possibility. And otherwise, education programs in schools targeted both to boys and girls, that kind of slowly works on social norms. And these are just a few of the examples. Again, there is not going to be a silver bullet. There is going to be many silver pellets, many possible things that need to be done together to create overall a conducive environment for women.
Actually, you answered my last question. I was about to ask you that as a role model, you're the second and only living woman to have won Nobel Economics Prize. And what message you will give to the young girls? You've already illustrated that vividly well, but I was turn that to another angle. That you share with us your experience of the little girl never let gender define herself. Now you are the successful role model, and looking from now, what dreams that the successful role model wants to achieve in the next 5 or 10 years?
From the point of view of being a woman in the economics profession, I think one of my objectives is to make sure that women, but not just women, also people who have been traditionally not given access to economics profession, so that underrepresented minorities in almost every other country can have equal access to the field, can enter the career, can start on the pipeline, do well in the pipeline, and together create a profession that represents better the world in which we live and creates role models for others. So that is a work that with JPAL we have really started, of kind of working at all stages of the pipeline to make this profession as open and welcoming to as diverse a set as possible.
Thank you, Professor Duflo. If I have one message to take away after the conversation today, I think it's creating equal opportunities. And that's the role of the government, of the private sector, and of excellent researchers like yourself and your lab. And congratulations to the great success. And it's a great pleasure and honor to speak to you today. So also thank you everyone online for joining the Nobel Perspectives series brought to you by Caixin Global and UBS. I'm Li, and hope to see you in our next episode. Thank you.
Thank you.